This is a huge topic to cover in 10 minutes, so forgive me if I speak a bit quickly, and hopefully we can go into a bit more depth in the Q&A. The Ukrainian crisis of 2014-2015, in particular the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, has underscored in dramatic fashion the need for a reassessment of the Euro-Atlantic strategic environment. This reassessment will take many forms, but there are none with the same imperative as that part addressing those most dangerous of weapons, nuclear warheads and their delivery systems. Beginning with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it took many decades for the statesmen and women of the two major Cold War alliances to construct a nuclear security architecture that rested on continual dialogue, mutual reassurance, and a commitment to reduce nuclear stockpiles. Events of the 21st century have seen this architecture threatened as the NATO-Russia relationship deteriorated, a process that of late has unfortunately been expedited. It is not an exaggeration to say that over the last year and a half, the security situation in Europe has dramatically deteriorated, with the post-Cold War consensus, as much as consensus ever really existed, buckling under the strain. This deterioration has inevitably affected the nuclear relationship in Europe, and managing this change is to be a major focus in the months and years ahead. It should come as a surprise to nobody that NATO and Russia have an inherently different view of what constitutes a stable strategic environment in Europe. I'll very briefly outline these conceptions as well as the role nuclear weapons play in the military doctrines of the region's nuclear powers. The map is a bit outdated, but provides a sense of the positioning of nuclear weapons in Europe, with the red markers indicating the position of US tactical nuclear weapons. You'll have to forgive the red marker in the UK, as that is no longer there. The Russian leadership views the current strategic environment as inherently unstable. This view is informed by Russia's conception of the asymmetrical imbalance between the two sides in conventional military terms. Put simply, the Russian military is inferior to the Atlantic Alliance in every sense, in terms of technology, military spending, and so on. This is compounded by specific programs, in particular the US Global Strike Initiative and missile defense, that Russia considers to pose a direct threat to Russia's nuclear capabilities that represent the only area in which Russia can match NATO. The primary role of nuclear weapons has remained the same in the two most recent iterations of Russian military doctrine, namely that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to a use of nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction against her and or her allies, and in the case of an aggression against her with conventional weapons that would put in danger the very existence of the state. However, this position is somewhat undermined by the use of simulated nuclear strikes in Russian military exercises, usage of which is consistent with a supposedly redundant feature of Russian military doctrine, the de-escalatory strike. More on this later. NATO draws a very different conclusion from Russia in terms of the stability of the strategic environment. As is firmly reiterated whenever the issues arise, the global strike and missile defense programs are not aimed at neutralizing Russia's nuclear arsenal, and in any case are simply not capable of doing so. This being the case, the nuclear balance is viewed as predominantly stable, although such a perspective is currently under stress. NATO on an alliance level maintains little in the way of nuclear doctrine, with the Newport Summit Declaration simply reiterating in formulaic language that nuclear weapons are the supreme guarantee of the security of the Allies. This situation is unlikely to change due to a reluctance within the alliance to expose disagreement publicly. NATO nuclear posture is given a little more substance by the individual doctrines of the nuclear-armed states, with the United States, France, and the United Kingdom all clarifying that nuclear weapons are only to be used in extreme circumstances in order to defend themselves and their allies from a state aggressor. It is also worth pointing out that no nuclear weapons state in the alliance maintains a no first-use policy. I'm not going to go into detail regarding the regime governing the Russia-NATO nuclear relationship, but we'll just point out a couple of key aspects that will have relevance later on. First, the New START Treaty provides a framework for limiting the number and deployment options of strategic weapons, and perhaps most importantly provides mechanisms by which this can be monitored. Secondly, the INF prohibits the possession of intermediate-range nuclear-capable systems, whilst the NATO-Russia Council, at least before its suspension, provided a dialogue framework to discuss and manage the wider relationship. There are a number of specific factors that contribute disproportionately to undermining the existing regime. The following is by no means comprehensive, nor are they necessarily new issues, but they have been given added prominence by the ongoing fallout from the Ukraine crisis. First is the challenge to the treaty system. There are a number of claims and counterclaims in this area, but chief among them are an assertion by the United States that Russia has breached the INF Treaty by testing a new medium-range ground-launched cruise missile. Russia has raised a counter-assertion that American long-range drones and missile defense systems that are capable of launching cruise missiles also contradict this treaty. Second is the interminable issue of missile defense. Russia deems the deployment of American missile defense systems to Europe as a threat to their ballistic missile systems, putting them at a strategic disadvantage and thus destabilizing the region. Indeed, the threat of the missile defense system in Eastern Europe is believed by some to have been the catalyst for the Russian development of the R-500 cruise missile for the Iskander system, the system initially suspected as being the reason the US has accused Russia of violating the INF. Third, and the issue I want to focus on, is the role of dual-use systems in tactical nuclear weapons. Discussion on the role of tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons has been a persistent but low-key topic of discussion in NATO and civil society, but I believe that events in Ukraine have given the issue new salience. Tactical nuclear weapons remain unconstrained by international treaties, in stark contrast to the well-regulated intercontinental and intermediary categories, and information regarding their possible use is scarce. Furthermore, whilst the number and location of American B-61 tactical nuclear systems hosted in European NATO members is broadly accepted to be around 200, the number and location of Russian tactical nuclear systems remain shrouded in secrecy. Numerical estimates range from 1,000 to 2,000, whilst the only assurance provided by the Russian authorities is that these weapons are held in central storage. The prominence given to coverage documenting the movement of Russian dual-capable, by which is meant units able to perform both nuclear and conventional combat roles, such as strategic bombers, in part reflects this worrisome ambiguity. Such concern may once have seemed exaggerated, but when it is viewed alongside the use of simulated nuclear strikes by such systems in recent Russian military exercises, these concerns appear ever more vindicated. As previously mentioned, such strikes are synonymous with the Russian concept of de-escalatory strikes. Such a strike, or the possibility of one, is conceived of as a method with which to force an opponent to accept a return to the status quo ante, or to accept what Russia has in the past termed, quote, new political realities, i.e. a status quo altered in Russia's favor. A feature of public Russian military doctrine between 2000 and 2010, the persistence of simulated nuclear strikes and exercises, combined with the Russian rhetoric regarding their willingness to put nuclear forces on alert during the Crimea takeover, indicates that de-escalatory strikes might remain a feature of unpublished nuclear doctrine. Lack of information in this regard can be severely destabilizing. It can lead to a dangerous misinterpretation of the other actor's actions, particularly during a period of confrontation marked by large-scale, high-tempo military exercises. The Ukraine crisis provides an excellent case study for the political usage of nuclear weapons, but also highlights the inherent dangers of such nuclear signaling. Strategic nuclear weapons have played a constant passive role through the implicit limitation placed on NATO responses to Russia's actions in Ukraine, as well as through strategic nuclear exercises by both sides. However, it is the movement of dual-capable systems by both sides that has the biggest potential for further deepening the confrontation. Russia has been particularly active in this regard, having dramatically increased the number and geographical scope of its strategic bomber flights, as well as openly discussing the deployment of modern strategic bombers and ground-based missile systems to Kaliningrad and Crimea. This map, taken from an ELN report on Russia-West military encounters last year, whilst not limited to dual-purpose systems, serves to illustrate the intensity with which the NATO and Russian militaries come across each other in a broadly unregulated environment. These actions are not necessarily direct threats, but serve to press those on the receiving end to be more amenable to Russian demands. So, what are the prospects for the future? First, it's important to qualify that the NATO-Russia nuclear relationship can't be viewed in isolation. The poor state of relations as a whole means that prospective actions in the nuclear sphere must be incremental in order to be realistic. As has been the theme for the latter part of this talk, the issue of tactical nuclear weapons is one that needs to be discussed more openly in light of the Ukraine crisis. Primarily, this should focus on information sharing, both in terms of numbers and positioning, with mutual verification mechanisms. This is crucial to avoiding escalation based on misunderstanding. I should say, however, that previous efforts in this respect have been rebuffed by the Russian side. Second, and I can't emphasize this enough, there is value in sticking with the INF. The US and Russia must now make decisions on where to go next with their allegations, and if mutually acceptable action cannot be agreed upon, then we face a dangerous risk of escalation. For example, the US is currently exploring military responses should Russian compliance not be forthcoming, and responses involving a US breach of the INF cannot be ruled out. This would leave the INF defunct and raise the prospect of an arms race. In a similar fashion, I would emphasize the value of continuing with the implementation of New START. Both sides have so far done so, but in light of the current trend, it is worth pointing out that Russia now deploys more strategic warheads and delivery systems than it did in 2011. And with New START due to expire in 2018, it is unclear in the present circumstances what might come next. And finally, decisions need to be made in NATO as to how to respond to Russian nuclear belligerence. One option, although this is very unlikely, may be to increase the importance and visibility of nuclear weapons in NATO doctrine, somehow factoring nuclear weapons into the new force posture in the east of the alliance. Although this is a clearly escalatory move and would be at odds with non-proliferation rhetoric, not to mention the NATO-Russia Founding Act, to which the member states are subscribed. A second perspective is to accept that NATO cannot undo its conventional superiority over Russia, so perhaps this belligerence must be accepted. But if so, it must be better managed. This involves a fine balance between reassuring vulnerable NATO allies and entering a phase of successive escalation with Russia. This is a very difficult task, but I'm pleased we're having the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.